Hi, everybody, and welcome to Attendance Bias, or really our little side project, Flocking Outside, with co-hosts Megan Glionna and Brian Brinkman of the Helping Friendly podcast. Very briefly, Brian, Megan, and I recorded a 3-episode arc about the band Goose about a year ago, the summer of 2023, for them to kind of catch me up and let me know where Goose came from, where they were at the time, and where we thought they were going in the future. A lot has changed in the previous year in the Goose world since then, so we thought we would take one episode. It was time to catch up, and I'm not going to spend too much more time on this introduction. The episode will start in just about 10 seconds, so if you're interested in getting into Goose, I would recommend going back about a year and listening to those 3 episodes, or if you already listened and you want to see how we've changed, what has changed, enjoy this upcoming episode. One last little piece. During the recording, I was away from my home, so my voice in this 3-way recording, this 3-way conversation, is a little bit off. The computer microphone caught my audio, so while Megan and Brian's voices sound crystal clear, mine sounds like I'm in the middle of an open room, which I was. So apologies for that, but I hope you get used to it quick and enjoy the CODA episode, the 4th episode of Flocking Outside. Everybody, welcome back to the CODA episode, episode 4. Maybe to be continued, I don't know. But for now, just welcome back to Flocking Outside, an offshoot of Attendance Bias, a mini-series about Goose from 3 Phish Lifers. So for those of you who are coming back, it's been a year since we've had this conversation. We, being myself, Brian Weinstein, the host of Attendance Bias, and my co-hosts, but you might know them better as Osiris Media personalities, co-hosts of the Helping Friendly podcast. Megan, Glionna, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Nice to see you again, Brian. I'm so excited to be back.
Nice to see you too. And Brian Brinkman, how are you?
I'm doing well, Brian. We got to meet in person a couple months ago, which was great in Mexico, and I'm very, very excited to talk Goose with you and talk what your thoughts are after your most recent show and kind of what the band has been up to the last year.
Yes, it was great meeting you. And I am just as excited to speak with the both of you about the year in Goose, but also from kind of a personal perspective after our original 3 episodes. So for those of you who are either new to Attendance Bias or missed it about a year ago, Flocking Outside was kind of a detour I took from Attendance Bias, where Goose was very much on the rise in the jam band scene, and then crossing over, I would say, even to more popular music, people from outside the jam band scene. And I just wanted to know what the big deal was. I know they were a big deal. Their popularity was increasing. So I asked and enlisted Brian and Megan, not so much to convince me to get into Goose, but why are so many people so quickly getting into them? What about them is different than a million other jam band pretenders who rose and fell since, I would say, around the late 90s or 2000? So without going back into the original series all over, here's kind of a short recap. If you're interested, I would highly recommend you go back. I listened to these 3 episodes lately. I'm still proud of them. And I think anyone who's either on the fence about Goose or more recently into them, go back. It'll give you a nice little starter kit. So the 3 of us gathered in the late spring or early summer of 2023, when Goose, as I just mentioned, seemed to be on this like meteoric rise that had no end in sight. And like I said, as an obsessive Phish fan, I wasn't looking for you guys to convince me. I just wanted to know what inspired such devotion in their fans and growth in the fan base. So I liked them well enough at the time, but I wasn't, as the t-shirts say, 100% sold on them. So if I remember correctly, Brian, where we left off, you said that your biggest takeaway at the time from Goose is that there was another band that could capture your interest in the way that Phish does, where you could kind of keep track of the evolution of the band, their changes, statistics, and kind of be part of a larger community. That Phish wasn't the end of it.
Yeah, that was very much how I felt about a year ago at this point in time. I don't want to bury the lead or give you spoilers. My feelings have changed slightly since then, which I think is going to make for an interesting CODA episode, because the last year has been interesting for Goose. It has been challenging in some cases. It has been there have been tabloids episodes. There have been ups and downs in aspects. There have been aspects of them their performance that I think for certain fans who came up with the band at a specific time have disagreed with, but there's also been really, really amazing steps forward, and there's been some really fascinating kind of diversions that I had always hoped for and wasn't totally expecting this quickly. So I have like more complicated thoughts now than I did a year ago, but a year ago, that is exactly where I was at. I was like, my God, I have another band alongside Phish right now. This is insane.
And Megan, you said that you were kind of impressed with the band's consistency and their ability to keep setting high standards for themselves and for their fans. Like you specifically were name checking the recent 5-show run at the Capitol Theater at the time and the overall connection between the band and their fans. You were very much about the connection there and the band's ability to keep challenging themselves.
Wow, it's interesting to think about that in light of what's happened this year. I think they have definitely tested their fan base's commitment to themselves with changes that's come through the band and definitely brought, some controversy, like Brian was saying. And I'm excited to talk about that later. But I do think that particularly now that we've just finished the tour that they finished, that they have continued to build that fan base connection and prove in a way that they could go through hard times together with a fan base, which actually to me is really important for a band. I think that that's how you create not only just adoration from a fan base, but also a deeper sense of understanding maybe who they are as people and as a band, that it's not always going to be rosy and they're going to have to make hard decisions. And are they going to be able to work through that? And what's it going to look like on the other side? And how is the fan base going to take that? And how are they going to feel about it? So in a way, I think that they've actually persevered through a lot of challenges this year in a way that has continued to grow them as an organization and as a community.
For my part,
Yeah.
I left off by saying that I had a greater understanding of why they had become as popular as they've become. But as far as fandom goes, I wasn't ready to be where Brian is and Meg, where you are, to dive in as like a fun stats nerd or analyzing jams like you guys or our podcasting colleague Ryan Storm is very much into. But I did enjoy what I heard, and I was happy to listen to them when they came around into my orbit. I would also be remiss not to mention that our final episode, right now we're recording in the summer of 2024. These 3 episodes we're referencing were in the summer of 2023. In the last of our 3 episodes, I mentioned specifically at 1 hour and 9 minutes that I said I hoped they would play at the Forest Hills Tennis Stadium, which is right around the corner from my apartment, literally a 5-minute walk. I said that Madison Square Garden is, quote, somewhere on the horizon, but they weren't there yet. I said that I couldn't wait to see them again live, and it took almost a year to the date for that to happen. I said, this is a story that hasn't ended yet. I mentioned that I would see them again if the circumstances lined up, and if it were easy for me to attend, I would. And so, just about 2 weeks ago at the time of this recording, it couldn't have been easier for me at the end of this past summer tour of 2024. So here we are. So
Worked out perfectly. We
yeah.
just need more
Yeah,
mustard
it really
now.
did. Exactly. And they will.
I hope so. So that's recap of our first 3 segments of Flocking Outside. So let's wrap it all up. We talked a lot in these first 5 minutes about a lot of developments and changes in the Goose world since June of 2023. The first one that I noticed is the continued growth of the fan base. They've only become more popular. But interestingly, it's kind of also changed in a way where there's a mellowing of the tension between Goose fans and Phish fans.
Mhm.
I don't know if you guys would describe it that way, because it was at like a peak at the time that we were recording. And now it seems like Goose has successfully separated themselves from Phish.
I get the sense that the tension has died down because the people that were not going to get into Goose or were fighting against Goose have kind of just given up that why don't we just let these people who like the music that they like it, which was always kind of my attitude. Like if it's not your thing, it's not your thing. Like I get it can be annoying to hear about something constantly that you don't like or you don't get. But at the end of the day, like if it's not something you're going to dedicate your time to, like just let it be and let people enjoy it. And so I think that there's been some of that of just like, okay, People have moved on from that sort of debate. Like, you're not really going to convince someone that a band that they enjoy sucks. And I think also, to Goose's credit, they've taken some pretty big risks and have also capitalized in really big moments. I would say one of them specifically being their first show at SPAC in July 2023, kind of the proper summer tour finale. They played a festival show the next day, but the proper two-set close, it was their biggest show to date. It was insane to watch the webcast and see that they had filled up the interior of SPAC. The lawn was a little bit more scattered, but whatever. It looked great on film. They played a really excellent show that night where they really showcased that their songs and their sound can hang in a giant amphitheater and in a venue that is known for Phish and Dead lore. They played great versions of The Empress of Organos and Thatch, both an old Goose song that people really love, and that when it jams, it just like it reverberates throughout the venue, and it just like creates a sense of community. And Thatch, one of their newer songs, has turned into an excellent jam vehicle, which we'll talk about later. But I feel like those types of things, the SPAC show, they blew out Red Rocks. They played another Goose Miss in Hampton. They've worked through some ups and downs within the band, and they've come out here in the first couple of months of 2024 playing really inspired, challenging music in a really cool way. That I think all of those things have kind of tampered down that sort of animosity within the scene.
Yeah, I think in the beginning, one thing that I was really interested in exploring last year was the kind of parallels to Phish, in that the sense of how the Dead community was really kind of anti-Phish when they first came out as well in the 90s. And I found that parallel really interesting. And I think it was pretty intense last year, but I agree that it has died down. I think the combination of what you're saying of Phish, Goose isn't going anywhere, I think that's been a huge thing. And just seeing that they can play at places like SPAC and like Hampton and do really well. But Phish can also go to Mexico and play a 40-minute chalk dust that is just unbelievable. I think continuing to see that those two things can exist at the same time has maybe calmed people down a little bit. Like, just because Goose is good and gets better doesn't mean that Phish is going to get worse or go away. I think that maybe was an underlying fear, and I think maybe this has helped that.
That's a really good point. And like just a quick add to that, like Goose's 2022, like back half 2022 rise that like really kind of started to spill out of just like this small pocket of fans happened at a time when Phish was either not touring or not playing extremely well. And when those two things happen, there was almost a sense of like, well, if Goose is going to get better, Phish is going to get worse. And last year proved the opposite. Phish had an amazing 2023, an incredible start to 2024, and Goose is playing well too. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, there was a
Yeah.
sense that it was binary. Like
Yeah.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
only one ring to rule them all. It's not like that. And I think the
No.
last year, calendar year, has proven that it doesn't have to be one or the other, that both could be successful at the same time. You can like two bands. What a shock. And it shouldn't be dismissed either that Goose went to Europe, by the way, that they kind of did their own thing physically away, internet aside. They played a series of shows where most Goose fans here in America couldn't attend. So they did
Right.
have their own little world. They've developed their own mythology. Whereas a year ago, I think a lot of Phish fans saw it as, oh, they're up and coming wannabes, which wasn't the case. But I think that was the perception amongst a lot of Phish fans. But the biggest concrete change, the biggest change or development is, well, Goose switched drummers. I think that's the biggest thing. And for me personally, that was a big deal. As a recovering drummer, my ears usually go to the drummer of any given band I'm listening to. And I know that they've changed band members before, right? Even in 2023, that wasn't their quote original lineup. But a drummer, in my opinion, is the heart and soul of most any rock band. So once you change drummers, you're pretty much changing everything. And Brian, you mentioned taking a lot of risks over the past calendar year. This is the biggest risk that any band could ever take, to change drummers. I remember kind of at the time that they changed drummers, right? Because they finished 2023. It was like radio silence for the first quarter almost of 2024 from Goose to the fans. And then there was even online, at least I could say, this kind of Pete Best / Ringo debate, like band forever, CODA or never, like that sort of thing. For me personally, once they released the Chateau sessions, that almost immediately was an overnight silence. That is when,
Mhm.
at least
Yeah.
I can speak personally, that's when I started delving in and getting more interested in Goose musically. I'm always interested in the drama, but musically, once I started listening to the Chateau sessions, I thought, oh, now their sound is much more open. There's a lot more space from a rhythmic point of view. And this guy, CODA, I'm speaking about, focuses a lot more on the toms and the cymbals, and not everything turns into a straight backbone rock beat, which I liked much better. If you guys remember, one of my biggest, not criticisms, but personal issues or preferences when we spoke about Goose a year ago was a lot of the jams kind of seemed copied and pasted from one song to another, that they were a little too repetitive. And I didn't realize until I heard Cotter play the drums that the drumming was kind of a big reason for that. So the Chateau sessions for me personally were kind of a turning point, in my opinion, of the band's music.
Yeah, I would agree. It was interesting to experience, I started listening to Goose pretty seriously during the pandemic because they were one of the only bands playing live music at the time. And then they had a great 2021, amazing start to their 2022, which all kind of peaks with Trey on stage at Radio City. And then going into 2023, I would argue the first 4 months are some of the strongest Goose that we'd ever heard. You had the Cap Run, the spring tour is really outstanding. And up until that point, I don't think there was really any chatter about any need to replace band members or change things around. Ben was a founding member of the band. By all accounts, he was really close friends with, founding members of the band as well. And, there are YouTube videos of them playing weddings back in like 2016 where Ben is on drums, Trevor and Rick are in the band. No sign of Peter, no sign of Jeff. It wasn't until I think 2018 that Peter joined the band, and then Jeff, who had been friends with them, came in 2020. So there wasn't really any discussion about this. And I said at the top, like, my feelings have been complicated over the last year. And part of it is that the back half of 2023 wasn't as interesting musically as I'd experienced with the band prior to that. They were playing a lot more festivals. There would seem to be a push towards breaking out of the jam band world and into the mainstream, which I'm personally a really big advocate for. Like, I think these guys, like young, attractive looking dudes with a voice like Rick that can also jam, like, go get your bag. Like, you guys should be as like, there's no reason that they should not be the most successful jam band, from a crossover standpoint. But the point that you made last year that really started to strike me about the drumming started to really permeate in the fall. if I look at my favorite jam list of last year, past like the spring tour, there's only 3 jams that ended up on my list from the fall, like in my top tier. And they were the jams where the band got quiet, like the Elizabeth from Las Vegas, or there's a Dripfield from I believe the Fox. There's a Thatch from Missoula that is really, really great. But beyond that, like a lot of their jams and their shows started to be this kind of like race for the peak. And a lot of that felt to my ears rooted in their drummer Ben's either inability or unwillingness or whatever it may be. I'm just presuming here to let it all hang out, get into a dangerous space where things may fall apart and then have to rebuild. And instead would just go to this very steady rock beat, always have his right hand on the ride cymbal for like 5 minute stretches of time while the rest of the band is trying to do stuff. And so it became clear to me that like there needed to be a change. We started to get rumors midway through, I want to say like November, early December, that things were up with the band. And kind of fast forward to Chateau sessions, I think you're absolutely right. Like within minutes of that being broadcast, you were hearing things from this band and you were hearing musical spaces that they had not gone to in 2 years' time and were eclipsing what they did at their last peak in ways that a lot of us wanted to hear, didn't know if it was going to be possible. And it was very clear that once you threw a new drummer in there who had a different approach, a lot of ideas were there. So that's a lot. Meg, add thoughts though.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. When we left Flocking Outside last June, I had been hanging on every note of that spring tour, every note, listened to every show, was so excited about it, lost a lot of steam throughout the summer and the fall as well, and felt like the Hampton shows, which were huge accomplishments just in terms of the number of people at those Goosemas shows, to play 2 nights in Hampton is epic. But the shows, I remember listening to them and thinking, I wasn't really sad I missed the shows, which is never a place I really want to be with a band. And on December 22nd, that's when they announced that they were parting ways with Ben. And it wasn't until February 5th that they announced Cotter Ellis joining the band. And there was so much talk online and in text threads with my friends about this move and what was behind it. And I think these situations are just like intimate relationships. You never really know what goes on between two people, and anything you can attempt to understand is just conjecture and gossip. But I think Brian is totally right. There's creative differences seem to be the heart of it. And after hearing this tour, I have to agree that it seems like this was the right move. I remember when the TED tapes came out in February, Arabelo was playing at the Cap and they were doing 3 nights there. Unbelievable performances just to see Rick, Jeff and Peter up on stage playing acoustically at the Cap for 3 sold out shows. It was really special and intimate and gorgeous. And during that run, they released the TED tapes, which were improvisational sessions with Cotter. They were never intended for distribution. The first track is the first time they ever jammed with Cotter, and they put it out. And the 9th track on that tape is Manu, which is just a gorgeous piece of music, one of my favorite pieces of music I've heard all year. And it's interesting because I don't know if it's Peter, but I think he usually writes a lot of their social stuff, but he talked about the TED tapes and talked about how there were these consistent threads they felt in the room, an ease of communication, free-flowing ideas, a feeling of effortlessness, and a patience that they felt that they could all kind of explore and have their personalities come out. And that's something that I have really heard, especially in those TED tapes, the Chateau sessions, like, wow, just absolutely incredible. They released those live on YouTube in March, right kind of in between. You've got the Arabelo show in February, the Chateau sessions in March, and then you have the April Cap run for Goose, which was announced pretty late. And it was just so exciting to know that they were ready to play with Cotter already. And it's just, to me, speaks to how excited and energized they were. I was lucky enough to be at Cotter's first show at the Cap, and the energy when he came out onto that stage, the way the audience embraced him, and the energy that he played with and the positiveness coming from the stage was so exciting and inspiring. And I think to feel embraced by the community like that, I think it showed the community was kind of ready to move on and excited to hear what Cotter was ready to play live. And yeah, to me, there's 2 huge main differences in the sound. I think the jamming, just this patience that I just talked about, willingness to kind of sit in a space. I think they used to find a lot of hypnotic grooves and kind of stay there and move towards that peak, like Brian was saying. But now it feels like they're willing to kind of float and let melody find them. Really, really exciting. I also feel like there's more driving energy so that when they are building to a peak, there's more of a sense of urgency to it, which is really exciting. And the third theme I feel like I hear definitely is just an increased diversity in the themes of their jams. Some of the jams they've played this year, thinking about like the Denver Maudevin, the Raleigh Pancakes, the Cleveland Arrow, the In Your Eyes Man, the Westville Rockdale, these are all like really different. You have evil noise jams, super gorgeous transcendent bliss jams, driving relentless shredding Rick jams, just a more exploratory feeling in general. And I think that there's an openness and an excitedness between the band, and it's whether you're watching like their YouTube videos, the kind of vlogs that they're putting out of them backstage, or the music that they're playing on stage or the way that they're interacting. Like I saw 2 shows on this tour, and the way that Rick is engaging with everyone else in the band is something I don't remember seeing as much of. It's just a connection, and they seem really inspired.
One last thing I want to wrap up with the drummer switch. One difference that I heard, even though I hadn't listened to nearly as much of the music as you guys have, is it lets Trevor open up a lot more.
100%.
Because when you think of Ben's style of playing, if you're a bass player and your drummer is playing not necessarily 4 on the floor, but always in 4/4 time, like Brian, you mentioned right hand on the hi-hat all the time and bass, snare, bass, snare. As a bass player, you're going to, I think, automatically drift to match that, to back him up.
Mm.
And so if you're always doing that, you get kind of stuck from the bass player's point of view. Now that CODA is kind of, like you said, Meg, like floating a little more, it opens up the bass to be more melodic and not as rhythmic, which obviously affects the other musicians in the band, you know, whether it's percussion or Peter or Rick. You know, the bass, I think in rock and roll, infamously doesn't get as much attention unless you're someone like Flea or John Entwistle or someone who kind of establishes your own, like Bootsy Collins, your own style. Trevor, in my opinion, is not that kind of bass player. So, and I don't mean that as an insult, he just kind of contributes to the whole. And so I think when space opens up for him from the drums, he doesn't have to play the role of a typical rhythmic rock and roll bass player, which helps everybody. So that's something I noticed while listening to the Chateau sessions and when I saw them live a couple weeks ago. One other thing that I noticed over the past year was when they announced their summer tour, when Goose announced their summer 2024 tour, their announcement of the venues that were listed. And Brian, you mentioned Saratoga in 2023. This kind of made me feel a little unsure of the band. Like, are they playing above the rim? When I saw their venue itinerary, like I heard rumors, and I don't know if you remember this, Meg, but before a Phish not the New Year's Eve show itself, but along their run in 2023, you and I were hanging out with Ryan Storm, and I mentioned that I heard a rumor of Forest Hills. Right, this is in December, I think, of 2023. And I said, I don't know if they're going to be able to sell out that place. It's 13,000 people. You know, if it's a Saturday night in New York City, yeah, maybe. But also they announced that they're playing the Man. They're playing Holmdel or the Garden State Arts Center. I don't know what it's called now. But I was skeptical. Could they sell enough tickets to justify playing these large-scale venues? Or Brian, I think you mentioned this. Are they playing its Phish in '93 move, where they sell about a third of the tickets, but they're starting to chip away and starting to get their foot in the door and get promoters to know their name? Turns out, in retrospect, we could look at it and say they made the right choice. But something else, before the tour started, I noticed tickets for the Forest Hill show were about $80 face value. All right, it's it's typical for what Forest Hills. It is an outdoor, bigger than an amphitheater. It is technically a stadium. But I looked at prices for the man, and I don't know if you guys were aware of this, but GA Pitt standing like all the way up front, face value was $154. And my first thought, music aside, was who do these guys think they are? $150 for Goose? Am I out of line? What did you think when you saw these venues?
I don't think you're wrong to have the feelings because they are still on the rise. And so there is kind of this question of, are they charging market value? Like concert tickets have just gone up. Like it's just the way that it is right now. I think that, 5, 6 years ago, the $150 is actually $80. And based on, inflation and just where
Exactly.
concert tickets are post-pandemic, like we just expect higher prices. I think to your larger question, like, yes, I do think that they played above the rim this tour, and I think it was a necessary step to see if they could. And I think that they chose the venues where they would play, kind of a bigger venue, and accept that they were not going to get possibly a sellout, but that they were going to exceed previous ticket sales and show the promise upon return was the point. And also to test out, like, can their sound hang in these big venues? Meg and I were both at the Red Rocks show the shows last fall. It was very clear in the venue that they had outgrown Red Rocks. It was their
Yeah.
second and third shows. It took until their third show where they sounded fully comfortable playing there. I think that they were pretty intimidated by the venue, but also the way that that venue seats people, the GA nature of it, the fact that it's like 9,500 people. It's Colorado. It's a destination type show for a lot of fans, regardless who's playing. The second night was awesome musically, but the experience was it was really stressful. You had to wait 2 hours to get into the venue and then 2 hours inside the venue, hold your seats, all this sort of stuff that, ended up being fine. If you got in at doors, like you had barely a chance to get above row 35 if you wanted to sit with more than one other person. It was just
Yeah.
insane. And I remember thinking, like, I don't think they can ever come back here. Like, this is too much. When they announced Fiddlers, it's 18,000. They did not sell out either night, but it was their biggest show in Colorado. I would venture to guess there were around 11 or 12,000 people there based on the fact that the Man and Forest Hills were their two biggest shows to date, which had 13. I remember thinking at Fiddlers very much as I walked in, this suddenly feels like Phish. The blue lights on stage, the music, the amphitheater. The biggest difference is if Phish played that, it would be an impossible ticket. Phish regularly sells out Dick's, which is 27,000. Them going 10K under would be awful. But for Goose, it was pretty perfect. We had tons of space throughout the venue. The lawn is pretty small and has awesome speakers on it, great sight lines. It kind of felt like this next level where maybe for this year or next year, they would play a venue like that, not sell it out. But by 2026, 2027, they're either returning regularly to Fiddlers out here in Colorado, regularly to the Man, regularly to SPAC, regularly to these amphitheaters that we're used to Phish playing. By that point, they're looking for either a bigger venue out here. Like the only bigger venue out here in Colorado is Dick's. I don't know how far off they are from selling that out. Not even Dave Matthews plays Dick's. The main circuit is amphitheaters around America. Like I think that this summer proved that they can do it sonically, that they can mostly sell these places out, and that because of that mixture of songwriting that hits at a mass level and also the more exciting jamming that we're hearing, there's that much more hype around them once again. I feel.
Yeah, and I
I
just wanted
totally
to
agree.
say, yeah, Meg, I want to hear your thoughts for sure. I just want to say that when I name check the price for tickets at the Man, far be it from me to tell people how to spend their money or how much money to spend on their favorite band. Lord knows I've made outrageous decisions. It was just some sticker shock for me when I
Yeah,
saw
totally.
it. Yeah, Meg, what's your take on the venues that they played, the size of the venues? Were you surprised when you saw this list of familiar venues, or was it kind of like, well, they've been on an upward trajectory for a while, it was only a matter of time, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I felt like it was only a matter of time. And as someone who helps her daughter get tickets as a teenager, tickets cost a lot these days, even for bands that haven't been around a long time. So I think I have less sticker shock, but I think the numbers from this tour show that they are not truly playing that much above the rim, a term that I did need you guys to define prior to recording. So thank you. Not only are they, selling out these venues like the Man in Forest Hills, but like Brian said, they're really filling them with their sound. And this to me was another step, like we talked about last time, of them really continuing to meet challenges and outperform expectations and just keep growing. The other thing that I think is really important to mention about Goose is that their machine is big enough. Their back of house is unbelievable. Their lights, they have the incredibly talented and wonderful human that is Andrew Getty. He's state of the art, adds to their show immensely, an absolute artist. Also, their crew is incredibly on point and organized. Sam King has been their tour manager since 2001. She is incredible. Got John Lombardi, aka Coach, doing just an amazing job directing the stream and all things Goose. They have it together in the front of the house and in the back of the house. And I think that's hard to do when you're growing really rapidly. And it's been interesting for me to think about that in relation to how Phish grew and how Phish really grew in a kind of folky way and a way of like, hey, just pick up somebody. And occasionally that turned out to be incredible. But occasionally it didn't. And they had growing pains sometimes because of that. And I see Goose handling that in a really incredible way. I think of like Greg Knight, who's been doing their PR forever, and what an incredible job he's done. They've just had really, really smart people working for them and with them. And I think that's continued to elevate their show and also prove that they can play in these spaces. Orchestrating an amphitheater tour is not easy. And I think they just did an unbelievable job and managed to stay really happy and engaged anytime I saw the crew or any of them. They were all just having a great time. And I think that shows that they're ready for this.
Hi, everybody. Brian here to welcome you to the set break of today's episode of Attendance Bias. First, thank you for listening. And second, just a quick reminder to tell you that even though Attendance Bias comes to you for free, it does take a lot of work and it does take quite a bit of money to keep the lights on here at production. So I just wanted to ask a small favor if you could support the podcast in any number of the following ways. If you could leave a review or a rating of it on whichever podcast app you use. If you could spread the word, telling a friend or someone you think may be interested in it about it. Or probably the most concrete way is to go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate however much you can financially to help with the continuing costs of Attendance Bias. So thank you again so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the second half of today's episode.
Moving forward a little bit, at the time of this recording, there was a recent article written in The Atlantic by a writer named Charlie Warzel. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. It was titled, quote, "The Improbable, Unstoppable Rise of Goose. Meet the jam band that might persuade you to love jam bands." And to me, this was kind of like our whole mini series from last year in one article.
Yeah.
Maybe it was a little bit less snarky on my end, but it was very, to your point, Meg, about their PR, it was very positive. And rather than the jam band that might persuade you to love jam bands, I read it more as the jam band that might make you stop hating the term jam bands.
Yeah.
It was like saying you don't have to be ashamed to like this band. We're calling them a jam band, but maybe they're not, question mark. And it picked up right where we left off. It opens with Trey's appearance at Radio City. It didn't quite capitalize the phrase passing the torch, but it did use it to explain the significance of the appearance. And the lead or the sentence that stood out to me, and this really hit home, and it's a very extensive article, but Warzel wrote, "For all of their recent success, Dead and Company and Phish are the past and present of the jam band scene, not the future." The implication being that Goose is the future, right? And I agree. I agree. I think we're all aware, whether or not we want to say it out loud, we're all aware Phish is well past, they have fewer years ahead of them than behind them. Dead and Company, they're kind of in this weird nebulous, no more touring, but we'll play when we want to. Goose is still on the way up. And I think that's their biggest asset, music aside. Because if they play good music, people will come no matter what. But in terms of marketing themselves, which is a big part of what this article was about, because there was nothing in here informationally that you can't find from any good friend who's already into Goose. That's kind of the thing. That's what they have on their side. If you want to get in on not necessarily the ground floor of Goose, but closer to the ground floor, you don't have to call them a jam band and be embarrassed. They play other kinds of music, which we all three of us discussed. Rick said, I'm constantly looking to create something I feel like I can get lost in. And that, to me, when I went to go see them at Forest Hills, that was in the back of my mind the whole way.
It was one of the rare articles written by a major publication about a jam band that didn't outwardly piss me off.
Yeah, it didn't make fun of
Yeah, same.
Like, most of them seem to like spend way too much time trying to convince you that all these things that me, the writer, I find annoying about this subculture maybe isn't that annoying. It's always that premise. And I kind of feel like that could have, from a journalistic standpoint, like read a few articles, understand that like this was the impression of the jam band culture in the 90s and it's very different now. And let's talk about the music and let's talk about what's actually happening. I thought that this article did that successfully. A couple things. I mean, I think one, you talked about or like the article mentions that idea of like Phish and Dead and Co being the past and present and Goose being the future. I remember specifically, so I saw 7 Phish shows in a row in the summer of 2022, Alpine and Dick's, and I've belabored them on other podcasts, so I won't I won't bore your listeners with my thoughts on it. I just will say I walked out of those being like, I don't know how much more this band has left. I found them extremely boring, way too tame. I did not enjoy, outside of a few highlights, a lot of those shows. And at the time, I was really, really getting into Goose and I was really seeing what Goose was doing. And fast forward 4 months, a couple of my friends who were here for the Dick shows came out here for the Goose Miss shows. And we had this experience at those shows that was on the level with some of the best Phish shows I've ever had from a vibe standpoint, from a communal standpoint. The shows were really, really good. And I remember walking out of Goosemas being like, I don't know if like, am I falling for another band in the way that like I fell for Phish? Like, am I falling out of love with Phish? What is happening? Like, it was a very strange sentiment. Now,
Speaking
Phish
as
in
a
2020.
divorcee, that's a very normal reaction to have.
Phish would obviously, like 4 months later, they would play that spring 2023 tour, which was one of my favorites of all time. Totally changed things, as we just talked about. Goose went through some changes themselves. So like we're at this point now where, as you noted, Brian, it's not, we're not in a binary situation. Like Phish and Goose are both playing well. I don't know how much more time Phish has. You're absolutely right. We're closer to the end than to the beginning, but also Phish is reinventing themselves in a level, in a way that they're almost like the Djokovic, Nadal, Federer class of tennis, whereas like Goose is like the Alcaraz, where these guys who should have stopped winning majors in the mid 2010s ended up winning majors deep into the 2020s. And now you have this young, Spanish stud coming up who is starting to take their way. But like you still have these moments where Djokovic will rise and will play amazing tennis in a way that you've never seen. That's kind of what's going on right now with Phish. I don't think that they're that close to the end, but they are at a point where it's like every Phish run that ends at an extremely high level, you're just thankful for, whereas Goose has this continued ascendance. I want to turn it over to you, Meg, just for your thoughts. But like, I think ultimately the article got right where Goose is at, what their appeal is. And the appeal to me is still this unknown, because Goose has written songs that should be in car commercials, that should be in movie soundtracks, that should be pop crossover hits. And that is something we never once considered with Phish. We got a little bit with the Dead, but my impression has always been that it felt a little bit jokey when Touch of Grey was a big hit, and like it wasn't really beloved by Deadheads. Dave Matthews obviously had some big pop hits, but like outside of like a 20-minute Jimmy thing, I don't think anyone would ever say like his band jams in the same way that the Dead and Phish and Goose do. So like we're kind of in this unprecedented opportunity where Goose could have a Billboard top 5 hit, top 10 hit, while also playing 34-minute really weird abstract jams. And that's just not a place we've ever been with jam bands.
There's two things I want to say about that. The first is that in the article, I think it was really interesting to me because it felt like a shift. When I've heard Rick interviewed prior to this year, he seemed to be more interested in songwriting and that aspect of the music and less about the jamming. And, you know, we've talked about how he actually made comments about like, I don't know if we need the Type 2 Phish jam fans. And it seems to me now that there's more of an emphasis on their jamming and finding places together in improv. And that had really stood out to me on this tour as well. And I am curious, and I felt like in the article that came through as well, Rick was talking a lot about jamming and what it feels like when they're playing together improvised music. And it just made me wonder if that's something that's been intentional or not. And something that I'm really curious about Goose is if they're thinking more about that, like maybe we can write these incredibly beautiful songs and play weird jams and we could still maybe have a top hit. But I don't even know if you're a band like Goose, if it really matters if you get a top like pop hit. Like I don't even know what that means
Are
anymore.
the Billboard charts even exist anymore?
Yeah, like the only ways that songs become popular now is it really if they're on TikTok and it has to have like this weird catchy thing that is just like, you know, like a Sabrina Carpenter, you know, espresso song that has this hook that you just is pretty dumb, but you cannot stop singing it. And I don't know that it even matters to have a top hit anymore. Like it's even different than if you think about the Dave Matthews Band comparison, like people listen to the radio then, you know, and they don't anymore. So I don't know that if I was Goose, I would give a fuck about having a top 40 hit because I don't even know what that means. It means that, you know, a 12-year-old's going to make a meme out of it that's going to be on TikTok. Like that's really what pop music is right now. So I think that maybe monetarily it's good. I don't even know because, you know, they're building something I think that they want to do long term. And I think they're really going with the Phish model. I think the only way to be a band that's going to be able to come in every year and play the man and, you know, play a big show in Colorado is if you have fans that are willing to come see you in lots of different places and multiple times. And you're not going to get that with a pop hit. So I feel like in a way, there's this thing that's happening with them that they're maybe driving for a different thing now and less worried about making it in the mainstream. But I think because of that, it's catching fire. And, you know, I've taken 5 people to their first Goose show this year, 5 different people. And people ask me all the time to take them to Goose. All the time. And people I work with, like it's just very interesting. And there's a lot more people talking at shows. There's a lot of chomping now because there's so many new fans. And who knows if they're really fans or if they just want to go see what this is about. But I think a lot of people have heard like this is a jam band that is not as weird as Phish, or, you know, that's not, it is more approachable. Their songs are more accessible. And I think it seems like they're in a sweet spot that maybe they are going to be able to kind of balance this incredible ability they have to write songs that are unbelievably timeless. Like I have never heard jam band music like this. Like these songs are sing-alongs that give you hope in life and like make you feel optimistic and in a way that is more universal, I guess. Because obviously, like listening to a slave jam or a hood jam is going to make you feel uplifted. But singing the chorus to Give It Time, you know, Goose's new song is something that a lot more people could kind of relate to and have that feeling of community with. So I feel like they're in a really sweet spot in that. And I wonder if that's been, I don't know, maybe that relieves some pressure as well. Like, don't worry about trying to have a top hit. Just keep doing this.
I do want to close out with talking a little bit about my second official Goose show, where they played at the Forest Hills Stadium on June 29th, 2024. I mentioned this earlier, but anyone listening, if you haven't been a long-time attendance bias listener, I do live in the neighborhood of Forest Hills in Queens. It was rumored that they were going to play this venue for a while, for months. I kind of willed it into happening during our last recording about a year ago.
Yeah, it was all you, Brian. Good job.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome to anyone who was able to go. I was thrilled, absolutely thrilled. I wrote in capital letters in my notes when it was officially announced. So I just want to give a little bit of background information about this venue. It helps give a little context to this show. I've lived for 5 years in Forest Hills. The stadium itself is a former tennis stadium. It has a capacity of about 13,000 people. It used to host the US Open, the tennis US Open. And if you've ever seen the Royal Tenenbaums, the Wes Anderson film, you've seen it. It's where Gene Hackman's character is riding go-karts with his grandchildren through these different columns. That's at the Forest Hills Tennis Stadium. It used to host concerts back in the 60s. They have big posters of the artists who used to play. I'm talking like Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Barbra Streisand. So like huge names would play here. And then when the U.S. Open tennis tournament moved to Flushing Meadows nearby in Queens in the late 70s, the stadium fell into disrepair. It was scheduled to be knocked down several times, but it's such a historic landmark that the community tried to grant it landmark status so it can be changed. So it just kind of stood there for several decades. It was renovated eventually and revamped into a full-time concert venue in 2013. So not that long ago when we're talking about decades. And Mumford and Sons happened to be the first band to play it after the renovation. What's important to note, and a lot of people who were there for the first time this past summer realized, that it's attached, the stadium is, to a functional tennis club, a very snooty area in the very residential Forest Hills neighborhood. I only mention this because the corporation, an HOA that owns the land on which the stadium sits, is very exclusive. And part of the stadium, the agreement of having the stadium reopen as a concert venue is that the shows would get a hard 10 p.m. curfew. There wouldn't be any concerts on weeknights. And for the most part, those agreements were honored by the promoters. So it would only be like 10 shows a summer. But after COVID, 2020, I'm saying, and an extremely limited schedule in 2021, obviously the promoters lost a lot of money. There were no concerts there. And in order to make their money back, they have started breaking those agreements just piece by piece. All of a sudden, weeknight shows were booked. The season started to have shows in May and even into mid-October. Now and again, the show would end at 10:30 or 10:45, and the stadium started booking K-pop or EDM day-long festivals where the volume level would shake the windows of the surrounding homes and apartments. So it became a big point of contention. Anyone who lives in New York City, if you've seen the phrase Forest Hills Stadium in the news headlines, it's mostly about the complaints from the HOA. So they started registering noise complaints and started suing the concert promoters. So on one hand, I was very excited about Goose coming to Forest Hills Stadium. But on the other hand, I was kind of worried about how the Goose crowd would comport themselves showing up. You know, I'm not a big fan of the NIMBY crowd and their complaints, but I also didn't want to justify their complaints either. You know, a lot of the complaints were people were drinking right outside people's houses or pissing on their front lawns, quite literally. You know, people were complaining about the crowd for Willie Nelson's Outlaw Festival. God knows what they'll complain about for Goose. So it's really exciting to have the party. But what happens when the troublemakers show up at your door and you kind of don't want to let them in? I'm happy to say that the Goose crowd was very good. They were awesome. It was a really good time. I was thrilled to be there. I was thrilled to host at my apartment pre-show. And it was to Brian's point earlier, it was also GA. It was either GA floor or GA bowl, which are like the seats, you know. So it sounds a little less stressful than, Brian, what you described at Red Rocks. So it was pretty mellow. It was sold out the day of. And it's a big, like I suggested earlier, this was a big get for Goose. Like not Willie Nelson, Neil Young couldn't sell out 2 shows there earlier this summer. So for Goose to sell out a show there is a little telling, at least for me personally. It was quite chatty at the beginning. The audience recordings are borderline unlistenable for me. It's so you could hear individual conversations, and you could also hear people telling the people having conversations to shut up. It's very funny from that point of view. But I had to go back to the Bandcamp recording and hear the soundboard to fully appreciate it. I just wanted to give some background about the context of this show, because it was hugely exciting for me because I left off on our year ago conversation that I would go back to see Goose if it was really convenient for me to do so. And this couldn't have been easier. So I wanted to ask, Meg, did you listen to this show? Did you have time? I know it just happened and you've been very busy.
Oh no, I've listened for sure. I mean, this whole tour has been fantastic. I haven't listened to every note, but only because I've been with family for the last 2 weeks and they will not tolerate that. But I I I was super excited for this show. The Man show before was just unbelievable. And I saw two shows on the tour. They're kind of lesser rated shows, but I was lamenting that when I was going to one show after they played the show in Raleigh, and I was saying to Brian, like, "Oh, I'm a little disappointed. I have low expectations." And he's like, "Well, there'll be at least like one great jam," and he was right. So even
Lo and
like,
behold.
and lo and behold, my daughter got to see her first almost 30-minute jam. So, baby's first big jam. Yeah, it was, I saw the New Hampshire show and is just a really great festival show. Great 20-minute Earthling and Alien. And in Charlotte, they have this beautiful Echo of a Rose that opens up the second set, almost 30 minutes of just really, really interesting, cool jam,
Wow.
very different. And yeah, I love this jam. It's hard to describe. It goes through a lot of different sections. It's really beautiful and really interesting, and I absolutely loved it. I could feel the energy growing as they got towards the end of this tour. And, to play out their two biggest shows back to back in the Man and then Forest Hills, and knowing they also have a show in Connecticut the next night. So you've got a show in Philly, New York, and Connecticut, and you're selling them all out, like, says a lot. I think this show is fantastic. I love the hot tea that opening with an almost 20-minute jam is just incredible. And the whole second set, though, including the encore, to me is a masterpiece and pretty exciting that they chose to play the Autumn Crossing suite, the Travelers into Elmeg. Those are like deep cuts. And the fact that they chose to play them in their biggest show in New York is just, to me, really exciting. And then encoring with Give It Time, which I mentioned earlier, is a newer song that is, I think, one of the best songs they've written. It's just so beautiful and incredible chorus and really meaningful lyrics. And yeah, I think that to end that show like that felt really special. And I'm really glad you were there because I thought it was a killer show, especially that second set.
Brian, did you get a chance to give it a listen?
Oh yeah, I'm a couch tour all-star. I stream everything. I've never seen Goose outside of the state of Colorado, and to this point, I don't totally plan on it. I'm very happy to stream them. My kids love it, and I can't pass up a good couch tour. So I watched this show. I thought it was good. I thought it had it's interesting. Like this part of the tour, when you looked at the tour release and you realized you have the Man, New York City, and then a return to Connecticut as the final weekend. It was pretty special just seeing that this was how they were going to close out the run. The tour kind of the way that it was charted out made me think of Phish tours in the way that they were, eking across pretty big markets and then working themselves up the East Coast back to kind of their home base. It felt like what Phish, when they have a really well charted out tour, that's what they do. I think also to your point about Forest Hills, like it's an interesting place that they're in because I don't think that they can yet play MSG. They're not going to play MSG until they can sell it out. And when they sell out MSG, it's going to be this huge event, probably next year is what I'm guessing. But until they get to MSG, like they're kind of hamstrung in terms of where they play in New York City. You have Forest Hills, you have Radio City, from what I understand, just like kind of stricter venues, just in terms of, the overall vibe. You can't do Randall's Island yet. Like you could play suburban New Jersey, you could play Connecticut. Like at some point, they're going to get to a point where Madison Square Garden, like if this keeps going the way it is, where Madison Square Garden is where you play in New York, maybe Jones Beach, I guess, or you play, surrounding New York suburbs where you go see them in Homedale, and that's kind of the New York gig of the run, or you see them in Connecticut. I would imagine they'll play Forest Hills maybe one or two times more at this point in time. It feels like a check on the box for them at this point in time. But in terms of the show, I agree with Meg. Like the Hot Tea was great. I Would Die for You is one of their strongest covers. I think this was like only the third or fourth time that they've played it. They should definitely keep doing that. The Autumn Crossing, they played that as the encore of our second night in Denver. Really cool to see that kick off the second set. But to me, the jam of this show and one of the jams of the year is the Thatch that comes midway through the second set. This is one of their more promising, newer songs, which is weird to say because it's almost 2 years old now, but still kind of relatively newer songs. It's got a really evil vibe to it. It's a bit more aggressive and angular than you hear from a lot of Goose songs. And this version, there's some really sick Peter on his guitar in this, and there's just really focused, kind of demented jamming that I want to hear more of, and I felt like we got it in a really strong way here.
It fit like a permanent stitch. Or is it on your lip? Has it been weighing on? Is it a little bit fucked? Did the rum come loose? Or did you change your mind? Thought that it changed. You better turn it up some. You better turn it up some. Better take that hill, grab the flag and run now.
Plus the Give It Time encore. That was the first time it had been played as an encore, and it just works perfectly in that slot. Just really, really good setlist construction in the second set and encore. Aside from the fact, you talk about the time constraints, you talked about will the fan base show up? Will the fan base cooperate with all these rules? Well, the reality is the band is still having a hard time cooperating with the confines of a 3-hour show, which is like one of the big things that needs to get sorted out as they go further, because we cannot be having 9-minute trip fields.
Agreed. Too many jams, I guess, right? They got to figure that out. They got to cut down their set lists, I guess.
And we talked a lot about that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, we talked a lot about that in our previous 3 episodes, where does a 9-minute song have to be 9 minutes? with a jam in it? Like, does more like, can a 4.5 minute song, does it have to go to 9 minutes? Can they just play the song and be satisfied there? Or can the fans be satisfied? I agree that some of their timing has to be worked out when they're kind of put in this constrained environment, but it's only constrained if you allow it to be, because they know going in what the limitations are, specifically for Forest Hills or any other venue with a curfew. My highlights from the show were, we all mentioned hot tea. What I really liked about it in the beginning, there's an interesting point at about 17 minutes, if anyone wants to listen back, where Rick is playing this kind of ascending guitar scale. And I think the rest of the band jumps ahead of him in the scale, but he sticks with where he's at. But they're all kind of patient and they all hit the peak together. So to me, that was like, oh, they're really listening to one another, because I'm listening with different ears than I was a year ago. Now it's almost 2 years ago when I went to Radio City. To me, it was reminiscent of lots of jam bands who have been together for a long while and then trust one another. Like if someone makes a mistake, everyone doesn't stop and try and catch that person. They all just keep going on their own paths and trust that the person they'll all join up together. I also wrote that the Goose chant is still kind of annoying to me, but that's going to happen either way. I really also like Yeti. That's a funk party, real easy to enjoy. This is also where Peter, I remember what you said, Meg, about Peter kind of being the face of the band, kind of being, hey, how's everyone doing tonight? If Rick is kind of a little more introverted in that role. But he was running up and down the front of the stage. They had these like boxes, these crates set up, and he kind of jumped over the front and ran up and down across them. That got the crowd into it. They had fog machines even, which was kind of silly because it was a little overcast and windy, but it is a rock show just the same.
Vibes, come on.
I know. But the vibes were all chatty. Everyone was talking so much. And I don't know if that's just a New York City thing or what Brian said, kind of a lot of new fans.
No, it's not.
Okay.
No,
I have not yet been to a Goose show where I haven't had to ask someone politely but sternly to stop talking while the music is playing and stop. It's not just talking. This is like a
It's
PSA.
shouting.
It's not even just shouting. It's like carrying on full conversations that have absolutely nothing to do with the music, about literally like catching up with someone's life. Like, go out. There are beer gardens in all of these venues. There are spaces to like have a beer where you can hear the music and have a comfortable conversation where the expectation is not silence. It is literally just like chatter with music in the background. I have no understanding and have lost all patience for the idea that you should pay whatever money, $5 to go and see music and talk through it. Like, stop this. This is nonsensical.
It was
Stop
very
the madness.
frustrating. Yeah, stop the madness.
It
Return
is
to
an
normalcy.
epidemic on the Goose scene. It is
really
a
is.
very fair criticism of their fans.
But I also wonder if you listen to a soundboard from, say, 91, 92 Phish, or not a soundboard, I'm sorry, an audience recording, it might sound a little similar.
I don't know. I don't know about that because they're in much smaller venues. In 90 and 91, they were still playing, for the most part, Main Street bars in college towns. And yes, it might have been chatting, but there were certainly fewer people. Yeah, there were maybe a couple hundreds. And it was almost, audience recordings. It wasn't that hard to hear the music over the small number of people who were there.
Yeah.
In a venue where there's 13,000 people and like 12,995 of them are having those conversations, it's overwhelming. I will, though, to go from a controversial opinion, popular opinion among the three of us, that Thatch was when everyone stopped talking.
Yeah.
Grabbed everyone's attention, a well-earned ending and a big applause. Highlight of the show for me in terms of improvisation. Loved it. And then, Dripfield, I liked it a lot. I think they started to feel the time press of the curfew. It sounds a lot like the album version, which I like. And the lick that kind of closes the song, I was humming it on my way out of the stadium. So it easily got stuck in my head. To wrap this all up, I wanted to ask you guys, how have you changed as fans since we last spoke? And what do you think is next for Goose? Meg, how about you?
Well, I think I talked a little bit about kind of the journey I've been on this year, but I am really, really invigorated after this tour. I think it's just been an absolutely amazing tour. I actually was curious to ask Brian what he thought about how this kind of ranks in as far as, is this one of Goose's best tours ever? But To me, it sounded like it was. It just sounded so exciting and energized and so many jams. And I'm super excited that they're leaning into that. More of that, please. Continue to get weird and do what you do so well. I'm just excited to see. I think for Goose next, I think they've been really smart. They've been live streaming all of their shows for free on Nugs if you're a Nugs. So it's, to me, that's kind of the equivalent of letting, tapers record every show in the 90s. They're like, here we are, come and hear it. If you, subscribe to Nugs, you can watch every show. They have a huge fall tour coming up. They're playing SPAC, amphitheaters. They're going to go to the North Charleston Coliseum, which Phish plays at for 2 nights of Goosemas. And this is their 10th official year as a band. So I think the comparison to 93 Phish is fairly accurate. And if they play MSG next year, it would be weirdly aligned with they're playing MSG in their 11th year, which is what Phish did, which is just very weird. But my hope for Goose right now is that I hope that they're going to write some new music, because I think they're ready for that and they need that. Playing these big shows that everybody's listening to, they need some new music. And I think they need to put out an album. I imagine that they didn't put out what they recorded last year because of the tensions or the issues that were going on with the band. I'm not sure. But now that CODA is on board and played 123 new songs on this tour, which, what an accomplishment to play those songs for the first time in front of an audience, in just such a large audience, to me is a huge accomplishment. But now that he's on board, I think they're in a really good place to write some new music and put out a really killer album.
I definitely agree with they need more songs. I think that we're at a point where we're getting slightly repetitive set lists at times and repetitive like highlight moments, and we need an injection of like 10 to 15 songs to shake things up. I think to your point, Brian, some of those just songs being comfortable between like the 3 and 5 minute mark. You think of like Character Zero is never 9 or 10 minutes, unless like it's a very specific version. Like that is just a solid, like we got 10 minutes left until we got to get off the stage so we can play an encore, throw in a Character Zero and be done. And, you just get a little bit more variety then. I think that we're kind of at that point with Goose that we need those songs injected, plus it will elevate the older songs. I think to your other question, Meg, like, I think that this is probably their best tour they've ever played.
Wow.
I think there's always this hallowed space for Goose fans with fall 2021 and winter 2022. You have this combination of momentum really starting to build. The band was jamming in a really unique and new way. There are a lot of jams and a lot of shows from that 5-month stretch that over the last 2 years you would throw them on and you were like, okay, what is going on with Goose? What is wrong with Goose? Like they don't sound like this. And so there was a lot of focus on the past and on like these breakthroughs that the band was going through. Last year felt sometimes like overkill, like a marketing and promotional just overkill of Goose. Where everywhere you turned, you heard about Goose. You had new Goose shows, you had new Goose guest sit-ins, you had new Goose venues that were now the biggest venue they've ever played. It just felt like a lot of like, as someone who consumes this sort of stuff on a regular basis, it felt like at times like they were ramming it down your throat, and at the same time not playing nearly as well as they had been. So there was this tension, and for someone like myself, there was almost a moment of like, was this just like a pandemic fad for me? Like, did I just get into another band and now like we're moving on and like maybe this just isn't totally for me? And I remember leaving 2023.
Again, speaking as a divorcee, that happens.
Right,
Sometimes
right.
you think it's more important than it is.
And I remember leaving 2023 being like, I don't know if I want to put a ton more effort into this, because part of it just wasn't. I felt like a jaded Phish fan who like got into the band in the early 90s and then they changed and I didn't want them to change. And so I was like starting to wonder, like, is this totally for me going forward? I think over the last 6 months, as I said, like they have proven that they made the right decision from a musical standpoint. It seems like from a personnel standpoint and from a vibe standpoint within the band, they all seem happier. There doesn't seem to be like that stress. And I think this year, like I'm just looking at my list of favorite jams from 2024 right now, it's packed. Like if they didn't play another show and I just decided I want to listen to some great Goose 2024, I would throw it on shuffle and I would be set for like, I mean, there's like a day's worth of music on here. There's stuff like the 6/7 jive lead that like shows their, bouncy, funky dance side, the 6/11 inside out that has this just like maniacal riff in it. The echo that Meg talked about, the drive from the Portland shows. Those Portland shows were like deeply, deeply overlooked and underrated.
Yeah.
The In Your Eyes that has this kind of plasma type jam, the Mississippi half step that is really cool from the first night of the Fox, the Raleigh pancakes, on and on and on. Like the Madhuvan, I saw two 30-minute jams in one show from this band, and they were both very diverse, very different. Stylistically, just a really quick endpoint on this. We talked a bit about this at the top, but one of the things that they have done that is really exciting is they enter jams in silence now, a lot of the time. You heard it initially on the 4/7 show, specifically like the pancakes and the drive, but the Madhuvan from Fiddler's Green here in Denver, they enter it in silence and in this weird abstract territory. And where a year ago they would have maybe hung in that space for like 90 seconds and then moved back into the song and taken into a big peak, that abstract territory lasts 8 to 10 minutes. And then goes into another weird segment and another weird segment. It's not until like 32 minutes that they find themselves back in Madhuvan. And that type of risk taking, that type of challenge, like they were not presenting themselves with that a year ago. For me as a fan to hear that, plus the fact that we expect like venue size to increase, I couldn't be more excited for them. I think the biggest thing, last thing I'll say, the biggest thing that changed me is because of that challenging period and because I kind of like, I felt angst and kind of animosity over what all was happening and what direction this band was going in. I kind of realized like I'm just better on the sidelines with this. Like I'm a big fan. I don't feel the like need to cover them the way that I did a year ago. There's enough great minds out there that are covering Goose the way that I have felt like I've covered Phish over the last 20 years. And I kind of just want to enjoy this. Like I just want to be I got my list of favorite jams, I got my list of favorite shows, but like the hot takes, the the political drama that you get with jam bands that come with them. I kind of just want to sit that one out and just enjoy the ride.
It's
I'm
funny
here for that.
because I feel similarly, but in a weird way, the opposite. I, like I said, I love the political drama, but I don't want to really be involved in it. So I'm happy to kind of, like I said earlier, get into them when they're around, listen to the highlights when they're played, but I don't have that same natural curiosity to learn about the lore, the mythology, to compare different versions of different songs. I like when, Meg brings up a certain version of a song, or Brian, you list like 3 or 4 highlights in a row. I'm excited to hear those, but I'm not necessarily motivated on a very base level to go and dig around for what else is there. Like I'm not going
Mhm.
to absorb and memorize their version of the Farmer's Almanac in the way that I did with Phish,
Right.
20 whatever years ago.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be on the fringes. And I think I've changed a lot because a year ago, as everyone who's listening to this probably knows, I was just kind of surrounded by it, but knowing nothing about it. Now I know what I would consider a minimal bit about it, a minimum of it, but I feel comfortable going in. So I'm not like a big diehard every dyed in the wool fan, but when they're around, like you said, you're not Brian, you're not, totally motivated to leave Colorado to go see them. I feel similarly about New York, but when they're here, I'm going.
Yeah, that's I'm gonna go both nights, and I brought my son to night 2, and we hung out on the lawn, and he had a killer time. Like Meg said, there's a little bit less like danger in bringing newer people to a Goose show versus like a Phish show, and so it is a nice way to provide the vibe of the jam band scene,
Yeah.
without all the kind of scariness. And maybe that's to their benefit because when Phish was getting big and Jerry passed away and you inherited the entire Grateful Dead scene into Phish, I think that threw them off in a lot of cases and threw aspects of the scene off. With Goose, you have this, like we said at the top, you have this beautiful, meeting of Phish is still playing great music. And so there are people that can throw all their weight into going to see Phish, or you have all these people who are just seeing Goose and maybe not seeing Phish. And then you have a few, you have some people that are kind of going between the two of them. And having that breathing room as they grow, I think is going to ultimately be to their benefit.
Yeah,
Well,
I
on
think
that,
that's been really nice too, because I feel like there's a sense for me that I will travel to see Goose because I really like I wanted to be able to see them on the fall tour, so I'm going to travel to see them. But it's also a chance for me to have an excuse to escape and go on a little adventure with my girlfriends. But I think that having one foot in and one foot out, and also I think a history of being obsessed with one band helps put things in perspective where maybe I don't need to be as obsessed with this band, but I can still super love them and kind of get what I want from it.
well, on that note, it's been a year. I think we came back as different people, but the same persons. So thank you to both Brian Brinkman, Megan Glionna, both co-hosts of the Helping Friendly podcast for this CODA episode. So kind of a add-on in addition to the introduction. Now we're kind of floating in the middle of it. To be continued, maybe, question mark, we'll find out. We're not going to make that decision if we ever make it. But guys, thank you so much for not only introducing me to this world and this music, but also kind of from afar shepherding me into it so that I could just have a really good time at, even though it was my second show, it was really my first show in a sense.
Mm.
So I appreciate it. Thank you for joining me today. I can't wait until we release this episode and the feedback that we get. So thank you again. Very much appreciated.
Thanks,
Thank you, Brian.
Brian. Go listen to that Denver Madhavan. Let us know what you think.
And that's it for episode 4, the CODA episode of Flocking Outside. I would like to take a moment to thank Brian and Megan for taking their time to join me and kind of catch me up and take the time to discuss what's happened over the past year in the Goose world. If you liked hearing their take on things, you should definitely check out the Helping Friendly podcast on Osiris Media. Next week, we'll be back to our usual format for attendance bias. And just in case you are interested, in the show notes today, you can read the article about Goose from The Atlantic. And you can also check out the playlist that Brian and Megan put together for the musical excerpts that were in today's episode. So thank you again so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Attendance Bias.